Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. It's time for the GunGuyTV podcast.
Hi, this is Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for listening to the GunGuyTV audio podcast and supporting GunGuyTV the way you do. I am extremely grateful. As I've said many times, I don't do this for a living. I do it because I'm passionate about the Second Amendment. It actually is something that my wife and I invest our time and money in because we have a strong belief in the United States Constitution and in the Second Amendment in particular. So I'm very grateful that you listen to the Gun Guy TV podcast and you support it the way you do. It is growing. I'm very grateful. It's growing like crazy in listenership. The YouTube channel has taken off. We're well over 100,000 subscribers at this point and about, depending, around 600,000 views a month, which is astounding to me. And it's all because of you. Thank you very much for what you do. I am very, very grateful. Now, if you would like to support Gun Guy TV just to keep us going financially, we'll certainly accept that support as well. One way you can do that is to go on Patreon and support us there. There are a number of things available on Patreon as far as additional content you can't get anywhere else. For example, there are behind-the-scenes posts and pictures and things like that about what I happen to be doing at the time, or some of it is gun-related, some of it isn't. For example, I was in Mexico the other day getting a whole bunch of dental work done, so took some pictures from Mexico while I was there. I was out with one of my kids doing some photography. We love photography, and I put some pictures up there. But there's also some stuff from hunting trips I've been on and other things available. Plus, there's the second half an hour of this podcast, which is an hour long, that is available only on Patreon. The first half hour is syndicated all over the place, and that's free. The second half an hour is available on Patreon. And then there's a video podcast that I do once a month in which I offer some training tips as a longtime instructor, both a law enforcement instructor and a security instructor, as well as teaching a lot of civilians. The podcast I launched just the other day, for example, episode 37 of the video podcast, was on surviving edged weapon attacks and charging attackers. And I used some video from an attack along with some other things. We talked about the reality of those kinds of attacks, and that's on the video podcast, which again is available only on Patreon. So I urge you to check Patreon out and see if we've got something up there that might be interesting for you. Now, in this podcast, I'd like to address two things. First, in the first half hour, I want to talk about our kids, grandkids, and so on, the next generations that are coming up. And how are we going to involve them in some fashion in the shooting sports, in a love for the United States, in a love for the Constitution? How do we do that? And then in the second half an hour of the podcast, a discussion which is, well, kind of unrelated but not, and that is, what is a battery of guns? And what does that mean? I have a battery of guns. Now, I've covered this on the YouTube channel on Gun Guy TV in video form some time back, but I want to talk about it a little bit here. I'll explain to you what my battery of guns consists of and how it's actually changed over the years. Now it's grown. We'll talk about that in the second half hour of the podcast. But right now I'd like to address the kids, whether they're grandkids, great-grandkids, kids, or whatever. My wife and I have raised children. We have one who is not quite out of high school, but the other kid's grown, and we don't have any grandkids as of yet. That said, we've helped, I guess you could say, with a lot of kids at church over the last 2.5 decades, or almost 3 decades. We've been members of the same church. We've watched a lot of kids grow up. Some of them have become leaders in our church in one capacity or another, whether it's leading the campus ministry, or the teen ministry, or youth and family, or whatever. It's been great to watch them grow and to see our friends' kids grow. And by virtue of my age, I'm older than most of my friends who have kids my kids' age. Most of them started much younger than I, and so they've got grandkids at this point, and I don't. But watching their kids grow as well, and then seeing the kids at school as our kids were going through school has been quite an education as well. In fact, one of the things I've come to as a conclusion is this, that children are to be raised, not just grown. Well, you can grow them. If you water them and feed them, they'll grow, but they'll grow in directions that you don't necessarily want them to grow a lot of the time. They need to be raised, much in the same way that if you have a vineyard and you want your vines to prosper, you have to take that grapevine and you have to train it and teach it and wrap it around where you want it to grow and guide it and raise that vine. If you don't, if you just grow it, it's going to grow in weird directions and it may not produce what you're hoping it's going to produce, which in the case of the grapes is grapes that can be made into wine, or grapes that can be sold, or grapes that can be consumed, that are beautiful and delightful in flavor and produce a wonderful product. And where kids are concerned, it's been my experience that kids that are just grown often end up going in very strange directions. We know, my wife and I, a lot of people who have essentially grown their kids. They were not involved with their kids when they were small. They didn't set aside time for them. They were too busy working, too busy spending time on career. We've known folks in the ministry who have spent so much time and so much effort saving the world that they ignored their kids, and their kids want nothing to do with the church that they're part of, or nothing to do with Christianity at all, nothing to do with anything that their parents are involved in. Because what they see is those things my parents are involved in, my parents thought those were more important than me. I want nothing to do with those. So there's this danger in just letting our kids be grown that one day they'll come to resent the things that we love, because they see those things as getting in the way of our attention to them. I'll give you an example. When Nick is the only child that I have that I publicize. The rest we don't talk about that much because there are too many weirdos in the world. Nick is a grown man. He's 6'6" and 300 pounds and an expert shot and very capable of taking care of himself. So I don't worry about him being all over YouTube and all those other things. But the other kids, we don't do that with, and you probably shouldn't either. But but that's a personal preference, I suppose. But I'll use Nick as an example here. When Nick was about, I'm going to say 12 or 13, I was a deacon, a congregational deacon in our church, and Nick came to me and said, "Dad, I believe in God, but I don't." I said, "Okay, that's fair. I get it. So why do you believe in God, but you don't?" And he began to explain that he wanted to believe in God, and he sort of believed in God, but you can't see him, you can't touch him, you can't hear him, you can't interact with him in a way that your senses can pick up. So he said, "Well, I don't really know if he's real." My wife and I talked about that, prayed about that, and I immediately called some elders in our church whom we respected tremendously. And our church was going through some changes and some growing pains at the time. So we were super busy with church stuff, in addition to work and running the business that we own and all the other things. We talked to them and we said, "You know what? We want to step down." And they said, "Why?" And we told them, "Because Nick needs my attention as his father right now. He needs me to help him see God." Now, I'm using this example, but this applies to hunting, fishing, the Second Amendment, whatever our belief structures are, whatever direction we hope to mold our kids to go. After we had the discussion on the phone, the little conference call, they agreed completely, and we formally stepped down from that role as a congregational deacon. We have 5 congregations here in San Diego County, and so we were running all over the place. Well, all of a sudden the meetings went away, and Saturday mornings became time for Nick and I. In fact, I said to him on a Friday night, I said, "Nick, tomorrow morning I'm going to take you someplace special. We're going to get up at 5:30. We're going to go someplace I want to show you, and then we're going to go get ourselves a burrito." And he said, "Where are we going?" I said, "That's the surprise. I'm not telling you. You'll find out in the morning." So he was all jazzed about getting up early. We got up early. We got in the truck, and I took him out to my favorite spot in La Jolla, where there's a place where you can sit on the rock. And when the tide is coming in, I had looked at the tide schedule. The tide was coming in. When it comes in, it hits that rock, and it comes up in this huge, incredible spray of water. It's a huge wave that hits, comes right up right in front of you and splits as if you're the bow of a ship. And part of it goes to the right, part of it goes to the left. You're right in the middle. You just know you're going to get drenched, but you don't. The whole thing misses you and flows away, and it's right in front of you. You get some ocean spray, but you don't get wet. So we're sitting there, and these waves are coming in crashing like that. And I busted open a Bible, and I said, let me just read you something because I want you to see something that maybe you haven't seen before. And he said, okay. And I read in Genesis where God created the earth and the oceans and these various things. And that's all I read. And I said, son, you know what? We can't see God, but we can see the things he does. I said, you remember your great-grandpa Charlie, right? And he said, yeah. And we have paintings all over our home that my grandpa Charlie painted because he was an incredible artist. These are these beautiful paintings. I said, you look at Charlie's paintings, you look at great-grandpa's paintings, what do you see? He said, well, I see a lot of great-grandpa in them. I said, well, you know what? God is the same way. We can't see him, but we can see what he creates, and we can see the majesty of what he does, and it helps us understand who he is. And that was the beginning of a multi-year journey of my investment of time in my son, where every Saturday morning for about 3 years, we got up every morning, and I had to find another unique place somewhere in San Diego County to take him so that he could see God. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate to everything, perhaps, but it does demonstrate raising your child as opposed to growing your child. Growing your child would amount to, okay, he doesn't believe in God. Let me find somebody to spend time with and maybe they can help him. Well, that has some value too, but that's assigning your responsibility as a parent to someone else. If you're a parent, then you need to parent. Just as if you're a vine grower, whatever they call that person, you need to attend the vine. Now, we'll talk about how that relates to the Second Amendment and our understanding of America in just a minute. I mentioned one way that you can support GunGuyTV, which was on Patreon. And if you find that there's value there for you, that you're interested in that additional content, then I think that's awesome, and I would encourage you to do that. I'm a little different on Patreon than some folks. I don't do drawings and mail things to people and give things away because, frankly, with work, I just don't have the time to do it. I'm also not trying to make a full-time living out of GunGuyTV. I make a very good living from practical defense systems. So this is a labor of love, not necessarily a labor of capitalism, if you want to call it that. So I don't do that. I provide the online content. But if that doesn't work for you, another way that you can help GunGuyTV that doesn't cost you a dime is to use our Amazon link to shop Amazon. If you're shopping Amazon anyway, Amazon, I like Amazon Prime and some other things, even though Amazon itself is not a Second Amendment-friendly company, we can pick their pocket a little bit and support Second Amendment causes. And I know a lot of people ask you to do this. I'm going to ask you to do it occasionally with our link. If you want to do it all the time with our link, I won't complain. But if you use our link, what happens is when you buy something from Patreon, or buy something from Amazon, rather, they give us a small marketing fee. It doesn't cost you anything. Your pricing is the same. Your Amazon Prime works. Your shipping's the same. Nothing changes for you. It's just a little fee that they pay us because you went to Amazon through our link. So you'll find the link in the description of the podcast if you're listening where you can see the description. If not, if you'll go to GunGuy.tv, or you can go to GunGuyTV.com or GunGuyTV.net. It'll all take you to the same place. And on the top of our website, there is a banner for Amazon. If you click on that, it will take you to that link. Then you can bookmark that link and label it GunGuyTV, and whenever you want to use it, you can, and it will benefit us a little bit. Doesn't make a lot, but you know what? Every little bit helps, and we are very, very grateful for it.
You're listening to the GunGuyTV podcast. Please pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Once you get the concept of raising your kids as opposed to growing them, you begin to see where you've succeeded and where you've failed. And I'm not speaking about you in particular. I'm using the word you metaphorically, because as a father, I can tell you there are areas where I've done well and areas where I just really have done horribly. And those memories and the things of the mistakes that I've made with my kids are very painful, because my children are extremely important to me, just as they are to their mom. They're extremely important. When I'm gone, when she's gone, our children will carry on, if you want to call it this, the legacy of our family. And like a lot of people, I didn't have the best childhood in the world. My wife did not have the best childhood in the world. My parents had a lot of issues, and her parents had a lot of issues, and they did a lot of damage. They did some things right, too. I think every parent makes mistakes and also does things well. But our real hope was that in raising our kids, we would not repeat the mistakes that our parents made. Now, in the process, we made our own, I'm sure. In fact, I know we did. But we wanted to try to end that cycle of treating your kids and raising your kids exactly the same way you were raised. Because sometimes when we do that, we share things that just really don't work and that do harm. So we were really working not to do that. And I think in a large part, we've succeeded in those areas. Now, like I said, we've made our own mistakes, but one thing's for sure, we could never be accused of growing our kids. We've actually taken the time and made the effort to raise them. And as a result, when Nick was coming up, I got him into shooting early, because to me, the Second Amendment is the amendment that protects all other amendments. It's the guarantee of the right to keep and bear arms, which allows us as Americans to protect all the other rights. If we don't have the right to keep and bear arms, then we essentially have constitutionally protected rights with no teeth, with no consequences, where politicians and unelected leaders and bureaucrats and so on will feel free to do whatever they wish to us, knowing that there's never a situation where we could ever resist. This is why the Second Amendment is in the Constitution, and this is why it's extremely important. This is why, as the kids were coming up, we went to the trouble to educate them on their own country, to help them see how the United States was formed, why it was formed, what the grievances were at the time, and why we have a Bill of Rights, and why those rights are important. My kids, it's a funny thing. You know, we'd be sitting watching, I'd find a video or watch a man on the street thing or something where people would ask people on the street these elementary history questions, and they didn't know the answers. And typically they would do it right next to a college campus where they were asking people who had or were in the process of studying for bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, PhDs, and they would ask them simple questions like, who fought in the Revolutionary War? And they couldn't come up with it. Who fought in the Civil War? I will never forget that, where somebody asked these people who fought in the Civil War, and they would say, well, Germany and Italy, or some stupid thing like that. And then I would turn to my kids and I'd ask them that question, and they would look at me at middle school and high school age and be able to answer the questions immediately. And I'd say, where did you learn that? And they'd look at me and say, from you. Because unlike when I was going to school, I'm in my 60s, these things are not clearly taught in school anymore, at least not in California. California's school curriculum is really pretty bad. As a result, we have to train our kids because we cannot just drop them off at school and expect that school's going to do it any more than if we're whatever religion we believe in. We can't drop them off at the equivalent of Sunday school and expect them to learn about God. We have to do that. Now, the Sunday school is going to help, and to the degree that you drop your kids off at a decent school, school will help, and maybe that's a private school, maybe it's a public one, but at the end of the day, the actual education on how to be a contributing member of society and how to understand what makes America the greatest country on the earth, or whatever it is you're trying to teach your kids, is really dependent upon you. In order for the kids to learn why they should care about the Second Amendment, it's going to take parents and grandparents who care about the Second Amendment to explain why. I learned these things growing up not from school, but from my parents, from my father, who was a deputy sheriff, from my grandfather, both of my grandfathers, actually. I learned a work ethic. I learned a strong work ethic from my grandpa Bob, who was a machinist and worked very, very hard. I learned a powerful work ethic from my grandpa Charlie, who was a welder and a welding foreman, both of them during World War II, both of them born during the turn of the century from the 1800s to 1900s, both of them incredibly hardworking men. I learned about investment and real estate investment and that kind of stuff from my grandpa Charlie. I also learned how to hunt, how to fish. I learned the value of those skills. I learned the ethics of hunting and the ethics of fishing from my grandpa Charlie. I learned firearms and firearms usage from my father, who was a deputy sheriff, and from my grandparents. These are things that I learned from them. I learned how to be a man from men who were men. And now we, in our society, to some degree, we've lost a lot of that. My son is a man, and if you ask him why he is a man, he will tell you because his father is a man and taught him how to be one. Now, that doesn't mean men never cry and men never show emotion and all that kind of nonsense. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is Nicholas is an honest, forthright, hardworking American. He cares about people, and he's not afraid to show it. He's diligent. He's persistent. He's a guy who understands, as much as he'd like to give up, that giving up never accomplishes anything. Where do you suppose he learned this stuff in school? Well, I can tell you he didn't. Now, it probably helped him that he played sports for a long time. You get in team sports, that helps. But a lot of this he learned because these are things that we taught him as he was growing up. These are things we teach our kids. Now, by comparison, I'm not picking on people, but it's just the truth. By comparison, I can tell you that one of my children started high school and came home to tell me about, 6 months in, that the only child in the class with both parents still living at home, happily married, was my child. That the only child in any of the classes, and in high school they move from class to class just like you do in college, the only child in any of the classes with both parents living at home, happily married, was my child. And that is a tragedy. To this day, I am told by my children on a regular basis that they cannot understand why their peers are terrified of guns, because they've been around guns their whole life. I remember, and I'm using Nick as an example. Nick came to me one day and said, "Dad, can I see the guns?" And I said, "Sure. Which ones do you want to see?" He said, "All of them." I said, "Okay, well, have a seat." And he sat down in the living room, and I opened up the gun safe, and one at a time, I took each firearm out of the safe, and I showed him how to point it in a safe direction, how to make sure it was completely unloaded and safe, and then I had him do it once I'd showed him how, and then once we knew it was safe, I set it on the coffee table. And if he wanted to pick it up, he could do that, but he needed to mind the basic rules. Keep the gun pointed in a safe direction, keep your finger off the trigger, and make sure when you first pick it up that it's unloaded completely. Those go back to those basic 3 NRA rules, which are very, very simple. Always keep the gun pointed in a safe direction, always keep your finger off the trigger, and always make sure the gun is unloaded until it's ready to use. Now, there are other rules and lists of rules that you can use, but I used those with my kids because they were very simple. My kids came up watching Eddie Eagle, so they could learn simple things like stop, don't touch, leave the area, tell an adult. I bought the tapes, and my kids loved them growing up because it was a cartoon. And to this day, they'll tell you, "Oh, yeah, those were cool. I learned a lot." And they had gone to people's houses where there was a gun, and they just left it alone because we had already taught them. Now, back to Nick again. After I showed him the first gun, I went and got the second one. We literally did that with every single firearm we own. He was able to touch them all, hold them all, look at them all. He was taught how to make them all safe, how to safely handle them. And then when he was done, we put them all back away. Do you know that as he was growing up, he never, ever, once again, asked me to see all the guns? And he was never curious about guns because I took him to the range when he was 5 years old and I taught him how to shoot a .22. I have taught my children at the age of 5 how to shoot by taking them to the shooting gallery at the range and teaching them how to shoot a .22 rifle under my very close guidance. My kids are not over curious about guns because to them, guns are a daily part of life, just as they were when I was growing up. And as a result, they're not so fascinated that they're going to sneak over and try to get into the gun safe to look at Dad's guns or take them and go places with them or whatever the case. If they want to see the guns, as I told them when they were small and they first asked me about this, if you ever want to see any of the guns, all you have to do is ask me, and you have to look at them while I'm there. And you can look at any of the guns you want, anytime you want, as long as I'm there and as long as you ask me first. Well, now it's no longer the forbidden fruit, and my kids were raised around firearms. I started Nick hunting when he first expressed an interest when he was about, I think he was just old enough to take the hunter safety course at 10 years old. And we went out and we did some dove hunting. And he was into shotgun sports anyway, so he really enjoyed doing that. Now, I have other kids who've expressed a desire to hunt at different ages. And so you get them out there and you get them to do that. But again, it comes back to investing the time and having the patience to raise the kids, not just grow them.
Shooting straight and always right on target. This is the Gun Guy TV podcast.
Now, I want to clarify before I go any further with this that I am by no means trying to lecture anyone. It may come across that way, and I apologize. I think it's because this is something I'm very passionate about. We have to take care of the next generation. So if you feel like I'm lecturing you, I apologize. It is certainly not my desire to do that, but I'm very, very cognizant of the fact that the vast majority of people I meet as I go through my life grow their kids. Raising kids has become a lost art, if you will, a lost skill. I don't see that many people doing it. I don't see that many people engaging with their kids at all. My wife is a speech and language pathologist. She deals with little kids all the time, and she's been in the school districts for pretty much 30 years, and she will tell you exactly the same thing. Few and far between are the parents who actually invest the time to raise their kids. They invest the time to be emotionally present for their kids, or invest their time to answer their kid's question. You're going to say, what do you mean by answering your kid's question? Well, there are two great books about that. One is called Captivating, and the other one is called Wild at Heart. So you may want to look for those, Captivating and Wild at Heart. One of the things I learned from Wild at Heart was that young boys need to know from their father that they are strong, that they're capable, that they can grow up to be men. Young boys are full of adventure. That's why when Nick was small, everything was a sword or a gun or whatever, a bow and arrow or whatever. And I didn't stop him and say that's wrong. Everything was those things. I'll never forget Nick coming home one day and saying to me while he was in elementary school that a kid was picking on him. Wanted to know what to do. I said, well, did you talk to your teacher? He said, yeah. I said, did you talk to the principal? Yeah. I said, is the kid still picking on you? Yeah. I said, well, try it again. Talk to your teacher and tell him he's still picking on you. If that doesn't work, talk to the principal, tell him he's still picking on you. But at the end of the day, if he ever puts a hand on you, slug him, knock him down. I've got your back. He looked at me stunned. He said, really? I said, yeah, I've got your back, son. You defend yourself. You're a young boy. You're going to grow up to be a fine man. You don't need to be a doormat. I've got your back. Well, it wasn't a couple weeks later, and this same kid decided to pick on him, and he knocked him flat. And, of course, I got a call from the principal, whom his name was Bill. I won't say his last name, and I knew Bill, and he knew me pretty well. And he said, well, I'm calling you because Nick hit this boy and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I get it. Why did he hit him? Well, you know, he has reported that the boy's been picking on him a lot. And I said, well, did you do anything about it? Well, we did talk to the boy's parents. I said, okay, so what you're telling me is the answer is no. You didn't do anything about it. Yes, but we don't condone violence in the school. I said, fine, then protect the kids. If you're not going to protect the kids, then they need to protect themselves. I said, where did this happen? He said, well, they were on their way home, and we heard about it, and we just wanted to talk to you about it. I said, okay, so what you're telling me is this did not happen on the school campus. He said, no, it happened while they were on their way home. I said, so why are you calling me? Well, we're responsible for the kids from the time they leave the school till the time they get home. And I said, Bill, that's absurd. Are you going to walk with my son from the moment he leaves the school until he walks all the way to my house? Are you going to put him in your car and drive him home? Are you going to patrol over there and make sure those kids are safe? He said, well, we don't have time to do that. I said, then get off my phone. And that was the end of that. And what my son learned from that is Dad has his back, first of all. And secondly, is he doesn't have to be a doormat. He can defend himself. Now, he also learned along the way that if you're out of line, if you're wrong, Dad's going to call you on it, and he's not going to have your back and defend you about something that you did that was wrong. If you're wrong, you're wrong. He learned that in high school when one of his favorite teachers contacted me and said that he's not doing well in class and wanted to know how I wanted to address it. And I stood there and said, well, Jeremy Hirsch was his name, the instructor. I loved him. He was great. I said, Mr. Hirsch, if he's not doing well in the class, fail him. And Nick was standing there. And I thought Mr. Hirsch was going to fall over in a dead faint. He said, in 20 years of teaching, you're the first parent who has ever told me to fail their kid. I said, you know what? Some of the best lessons are learned through painful failure. If he doesn't learn what it is to fail, he'll never know what it is to succeed. Well, he succeeds because he's learned what it is to fail. Now, as a result, he didn't fail the class, but Jeremy Hirsch has told me many times as I've run into him over the years that I was his favorite parent. But again, this comes down to, how was that acceptable to my son? Because my son and I have always been like peas and carrots, just as I've been with all of my kids. If he was interested in basketball, then I was interested in basketball. If he was interested in karate, then I was interested in karate. If he was interested, I got one child who's interested in photography, well, I'm interested in photography. I don't care what they're interested in, whatever interest they find, I am interested in that because I'm interested in my child. And I'll spend time with them with it because I'm fascinated by my kids. I love them and I want them to grow and be great people. So I'll spend the time and spend the effort, and so will my wife. And this is part of raising kids rather than just growing them. And that's why I'm illustrating the point. I think it's very, very important that we're involved with our kids, we're involved with our grandkids, that we spend the time and that we don't. Who was it that once said nobody goes to their grave and says, gee, I'm happy I didn't spend any time with my kids, or gee, I want to spend more time at work? No, they have regrets saying, gee, I wish I had have spent time with my kids, or I wish I would have done so-and-so or such and such. We didn't want to have that happen. We wanted to raise strong, powerful, confident Americans who were law-abiding, contributing members of society. And the only way you get that is if you spend the time to raise them. As a result, my kids know what the Second Amendment is. They know what the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment. They know what they all do, and they know what they all say. And they didn't learn it in school. They learned it from us. So I encourage you likewise, if you're raising your kids, or you're helping raise your grandkids, or just spending time with them, I wanted to share with you what the influence was my grandparents had on me. Now, I mentioned my grandfathers. I didn't mention my grandmothers, but they both had a huge influence on me. I mentioned my dad. I didn't mention my mom. I should have. My mom had a huge influence on me that was very positive. Did she make mistakes? Did he make mistakes? Sure, they all did. Do we make mistakes? Of course. But that's where we get to grow, apologize, learn, and go on. Like I've taught my kids from they were very, very small. You win or you learn. You only lose if you refuse to learn something along the way. That's how we grow as human beings. We win, and if we don't win, then we have to learn something and go back and try again. And feel free to apologize to our kids and say, I really messed that up. And then what they see is that dad or mom is an honest person who admits their mistakes and keeps on trying, and they learn to do the same. Anyway, I know that wasn't specifically gun-related, but sometimes we have to talk about how we're going to save this country by saving the family. Because if we don't save the family, if we don't raise the next generation of Americans who understand their rights and are willing to defend them, then we have already lost. I encourage you, if you're not already doing that, well, this is an opportunity for you to learn and grow and go do likewise. Amen? So there you are. Now, if you're listening on the syndicated podcast, I'm going to wrap up this part of the podcast here. If you're on Patreon, stick with me because we're going to continue. We're going to talk about a battery of guns and what it means to have a battery of guns, and I'll tell you about mine. That'll be kind of cool, huh? Thank you very much for listening. Once again, if we're wrapping up the podcast, I want to thank you for listening. Please check us out on Patreon where you can hear the balance of the podcast anytime you'd like if you want to help us out there. In the meantime, wherever you go, whatever you do, please be safe.
You've been listening to the GunGuy TV podcast.